Maybe you can just spend a couple more minutes talking about creoles and
Oh, yeah.
why those are interesting.
They are really interesting. So normally when languages develop, they developed what we call in sort of a natural sense, where the clearest case that people might be familiar with is Latin turning into Spanish, Portuguese,
Hmm.
Italian, French, etc., where there was one language, and now you fast forward 2,000 years, and now we have several languages because people go off into to different areas, hashtag dialectology. And then after a while, they become so different that people don't or aren't able to understand people that speak this supposedly the same language, but on the other side of the continent or the country. And then it's like, you know what? I don't even think we speak the same language anymore. I'm going to call my language, and then you can call your language, and then we have new languages that form. So that's sort of maybe the most common way that languages form is they sort of split apart from each other. In some extreme language context situations, you get cases where people are thrown together who don't share a common language and they need to communicate. So this often happens in colonization situations, or even things that are less bad, like just trade. So you get things where you get one group of people who comes into some new area. They don't share a common language, but they want to trade or they want to communicate with these people. And so the two groups of people sort of unconsciously decide to cobble together a language as sort of a mix between the two of them. It often takes part of the grammar of one language and part of the words of another language, but it's not quite that simple, but that's sort of what is going on there. And after a few, if that language context situation is persistent, like for several decades, you might get what's called a pidgin that forms, which is a sort of loosely cobbled together language that's pretty variable, and it's no one's native language. It's just sort of this thing that you do when you're in the marketplace talking to these kinds of people. You speak this way to them. So if that context situation is very persistent for a long time, it might spread to more than just the marketplace. You might see it starting to spread to other places where people talk to each other, maybe on the boats, or
Hmm.
we're working in other environments. You might see it spread to church settings, or maybe even maybe some government settings. And eventually it gets to be sort of the lingua franca of this particular speech community, where that if you're talking to a stranger, you can talk to them in this pidgin. Eventually you get people who have kids, and those two people, the only language they share is their second language, which is their pidgin, and so the language of the home becomes the pidgin. And so then what we get children who grow up speaking this pidgin as their first language. Now, the interesting thing about pidgins is that it's not a full-fledged language, meaning you can't talk about everything.
Mm.
There aren't enough words for everything. It has a relatively simple grammatical structure. But children, when that's all they're given, are amazing because they fill in the gaps. They start to create new words using the vocabulary that they have. They start to fill in gaps as far as language goes. And so these native speaking children, they turn the language into a full-fledged language, and it's at that point that we call it a creole. And so this Creole then is the first language of these children, and it's sort of this more mature version of the pidgin that their parents and grandparents spoke, or I guess probably do still speak. And so a Creole is just an interesting case where a language can be created, but not in sort of a typical genealogical way that most other languages tend to be formed. It's sort of this one that arises somewhat spontaneously in a relatively short amount of time, and it doesn't have a clear lineage to one language or the other. It sort of is its own thing. And eventually that Creole can be pretty widespread, where it's not even clear that it was once a Creole. It has a full-fledged writing system and poetry and different styles and different regional dialects. It can have just all the complexity that any language has. There are some languages that are just called Creole or some form of that. So in Africa and some parts of the Caribbean, there are languages that are just called Creole. And so people just think of Creole as broken English because it often has a lot of connections to English because English was the colonizer's language. And so it uses a lot of words. And so people think of it as, oh, it's like weird broken English and they must be dumb because they don't know what's going on. But really it's a separate language with a lot of influences from English. It has its full intricate complexities just as English does, just in a slightly different way. So